Hi everyone and welcome. Today I'm joined by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor, an analyst, and also advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. I wanted to speak with you today regarding what is going on as we speak in Syria. So I know it's not popular to recognize in the West that the Alawites, Christians, and other ethnic minorities probably had the best deal they could under Assad, and as many people predicted, when this government was toppled by HTS, sorry, um, we would probably see some slaughters and massacres, if not genocide, occurring. And it appears that, yeah, thousands of people have now been killed. The media has somewhat been bit slow, but now apparently reluctantly recognizing it, but still referring to it in very cautious term as clashes and yeah, other ways of framing it. I was wondering if you could outline how you interpret or read what's happening in Syria.
I think the Iranians always expected this. And the belief from the very beginning in 2011, when the United States deployed in late 2011, when they deployed Al Qaeda in Syria, because Iranian intelligence agencies knew this, even though the Americans were hiding it and the Western media was denying it, the Iranians were saying that Western intelligence agencies are working with the Islamic State of Iraq, which was Al Qaeda back then. And the Islamic State of Iraq set up the Nusra Front, which was Al Qaeda in Syria. And Jolani, who was in the Islamic State of Iraq, he and Abu Bakr Baghdadi's deputy, he became the head of the Nusra Front. So these deeply sectarian people were slaughtering people in Iraq before they began slaughtering people in Syria. So the Iranians knew that if Syria fell, that this would happen. For the Iranians, it wasn't a matter of uh, the Syrian government under former President Assad being some utopian state. The Iranians had no illusions about the Syrian government back then, but the alternative for the Iranians was much worse. And that's why the Iranians created this broad resistance front, uh, which of course struggles to support the Palestinian people, but it also struggled to support the people of Syria, and then later in Iraq when ISIS was about to take Iraq and Baghdad was about to fall. So it wasn't, again, it was a for Iran, it was a choice between a deeply flawed government in Syria and the Takfiri hordes that were being supported by Western intelligence agencies, by Turkey, by oil and gas rich countries in the Persian Gulf, and Jordan and the Israeli regime. What happened yesterday and the day before, I think, was inevitable. We've been seeing large numbers of minorities and moderate Sunnis and Sufis and secular people being killed in different parts of the country. But the ideology of these groups that have taken over the country would ultimately lead to this catastrophe. And they have, if you look at Jolani's alliances, many of the groups that are with him in Iraq, in Syria, they are far more extreme than he is, including those many thousands of fighters that come from China, um, many thousands who come from Central Asia, and even a few hundred are from Iran. extremists from our country. So these groups, many of them are far more extreme than Jolani himself, and so controlling these different factions and these different groups is virtually impossible. He does not have all that much control. He himself is of course an extremist. If he tries to hold them back, they could turn their guns on him and uh, his the supporters around him. So it's a very horrible situation. In all, it's believed that since December the 8th, at least 10,000 people have been killed. Many of them are missing, but it's believed that almost all of those who are missing are dead.
What are the regional interests being played out here? Because we saw that the European Union finally made a comment on what's happening after ignoring it. However, the EU condemned the attacks by what they defined as pro-Assad elements. So effectively blaming the Alawites being murdered, despite, again, the internet now being flooded by videos of, also, well, pictures of women as well being executed. And obviously these are civilians. And so it's very strange to see not a single critical word about the government security forces murdering the Christians, Alawites, but instead they're suggesting this is the fault of them themselves. At the same time, we suddenly saw this statement come out from the United States, and condemned what they wrote, quote, the radical jihadi terrorists. So it looks like the EU and the Americans are quite split on this now, while the Gulf states appear to be well, suspiciously silent and uncritical of what has transpired. How do you see the different actors defining their interest? Because usually this is, yeah, how it reflects in how much they care about yeah, human rights, I guess.
I think that if we look at how the EU was covering the genocide in Gaza, you can see striking similarities between the statement that was issued for this atrocity and the statements that were issued for Gaza. And in Gaza, as the Israelis were slaughtering people, they blamed Hamas and its allies, and also gave these vague words, said some vague things about innocent civilians and so on. Here you saw the same pattern. First of all, they called these Assadists or Assad loyalists uh, just because groups of people are resisting, that doesn't make them Assadists. They are being suppressed, they're being slaughtered, their lands are being taken, their homes are being taken, their jobs have been taken away from them. Uh, they are being humiliated regularly. They are being on in official outlets being called uh, people who are worthy of death and filth and other things because of their religious or their ethnic uh, or their racial status. Uh, so yeah, I think it's quite natural that they would resist. And interestingly, those who carried out attacks on these HTS or the Al Qaeda troops under Jolani, they were not slaughtered. They went into the towns and cities and villages and began slaughtering ordinary people, as we see in the footage that these people, these terrorists themselves put out. It's quite stunning. It's one thing to slaughter people, and another thing to willingly and happily take responsibility for it. Is if someone usually when they people commit crimes, they hide those crimes. But here, ISIS and Al Qaeda, they behave like the Israelis behave in Gaza, where they show footage of their crimes. These people are doing the same thing. But the EU, what they did was first they tried to label the victims as guilty, the guilty party, And then they gave some vague words about uh, civilians. The American position, which came very late, from my understanding, uh, because I just saw it half an hour ago, is interesting. Regardless of the fact that the Americans don't name the Shia minority. But I think the fact that they did write a statement that is very critical of what the Jolani regime has done, is probably linked to Tulsi Gabbard's presence. I'm just guessing, it's pure speculation, and probably or possibly the vice president. But Tulsi Gabbard, we saw during her confirmation hearings how she spoke out against Al Qaeda, how she even alluded to the chemical attacks as being false flag operations carried out by Al Qaeda. She said this in front of the senators, U.S. senators. So, and we know that she met uh, former President Assad. She knows a thing or two about Syria. So I'm guessing that the U.S. statement has some. Her influence is the reason, and possibly the vice president's influence is the reason behind it. But I can't say for certain. It's pure speculation. But I think the divide between the United States in and Europe is there's at least on Syria is quite similar as, of course, I'm sure you know, to the divide on Ukraine now. Uh, I think you can sort of see a continuation of the division that has now been brought about between the two sides. But of course, with regards to Israel and the Israeli regime and what it does, I think that that harmony still exists.
Yeah, you're probably correct about your assessment of Tulsi Gabbard because, well, she was often smeared, well, before she took now the position as the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. She was always smeared as being a toady for Assad because she did recognize that a key fault or weakness of the Americans, of the American government, was exactly that they were financing a lot of these extremist terrorist groups, which would be yes, which are to topple Assad, which would then end up in some horrible massacres, such as what we're seeing now. So the fact that she's now elevated from a smeared yeah, outsider to having this key position, it's definitely probably has a key role. And you're very correct. It does reflect a little bit what's happening in Ukraine as well, where the Americans are calling for a quick end to the war. By the way, also an increasing amount of Ukrainian, not just civilians, but on the political leadership as well, while the EU keeps calling for war. It's very extraordinary as a because the EU was always sold as a peace project. It was going to be a different kind of power, a civilian power, a normative power, one would elevate security by promoting good values and norms. And now it's yeah, it's very strange to see what has happened. I wanted to ask just how do you see this developing further though? Because again, all this killing of Shiites, Alawites, Christians, how will this escalate? Surely there must be some resistance brewing within Syria, or do you see some, besides domestic uprising, do you see some foreign involvement coming to their aid, or will it be a bit like Gaza, where they will just be slaughtered in front of the cameras of the world?
It's very difficult to say. When we had a previous discussion together, I was of the view that the Jolani regime will not last very long. I don't think that Turkey and Qatar will benefit from the overthrow of the Assad government. Iran, of course, as I said earlier, supported the government not because Iran felt that it was a fantastic and utopian state, but because the alternative was much worse, and also because the Syrian government supported the Palestinian cause. They were the only government left all the governments, the Arab governments are authoritarian. Uh, the Syrian government was just the exception to the rule with regards to the Palestinian people. So that was a second reason. But but Syria had become a burden to Iran, or especially in the last 3, 4 years, because before that, ISIS and Al Qaeda, which were first of all much more powerful, and since 2011 until 2017-18, they were a very powerful force, and the region was mobilized. Hezbollah, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, in Syria, Palestinian groups in Syria, they were all mobilized to fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda. And I would compare the ISIS and Al Qaeda back then to a cancer, whereas what we now have in Syria is more like corona. It is a weakened entity, though with the same crude takfiri ideology, which believes people can be killed just because they think of it differently from the terrorists or the groups that are in charge. But back then, Iran supported them because it was so dangerous. But Iraq was about to fall. Lebanon would have fallen. And then ISIS would have been at our doorstep. It would have been on our border. In addition to that, though, the Syrian government was facilitating Iran's support for the resistance. It was facilitating Iran's support to Lebanon, to the West Bank, and also through sea, I suppose, to Gaza. I think Iran's support to Gaza goes through many different channels, and I obviously don't know what they are, but I'm guessing that one of those many channels may have been through Syria as well. But that's speculation on my part. So Iran did, while it was, there was a burden, it did also benefit from the existence of the Syrian government. But during the last 3, 4 years, after President Assad, former President Assad, improved his relations with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, he tilted away from Iran, and under their pressure, he discontinued cooperation with Iran to a large degree to help the resistance. And during the last 3, 4 years, it was very difficult for Iran to cooperate with Syria on that front. So Iran was helping Syria. Iran was providing it with free fuel and other resources like the Russians, but it wasn't benefiting. And so basically Syria became a burden. That burden, that financial burden, has been removed from Iran's shoulders and Russian shoulders and Iraqi shoulders, and possibly, I think, a bit Algeria as well. I think the Algerians were helping the previous government a bit as well, although their capabilities are limited. Now the burden is on Turkey. It is on Qatar, and the sanctions haven't been removed. So the cost of Syria today, which is in which the situation inside the country, where the situation inside the country is far worse than it was even during the last years of the Assad government. It was going downhill back then, but after the collapse, the bureaucracy collapsed, Iranian, Russian support discontinued, the chaos. We saw chaos across the country, and then the Israeli regime began to bomb the country's infrastructure from north to south. And these terrorist groups, they murdered the men who were manning the air defense systems, which I find to be extraordinary. So not only did the Israelis bomb them, but these people destroyed the people who were manning the systems. So Syria today is much worse, and I don't think that the Saudis and Qatar are capable of filling the gap and of improving the lives of people. It's only going to be a burden for them. And Glenn, let me put it very, let me be very blunt. Iran, Hezbollah have been vindicated. Everything that we were fearful of happening happened. Although, as I said, if it had happened in the previous decade, it would be much worse than what we're seeing now, because these groups were much more powerful. But I think people now see what Turkey and Qatar and many others were supporting. This is the culmination. This is the success of Operation Timber Sycamore. This is what we have. This is the direct result of that operation that was initiated by Obama and the CIA. But again, I don't think that Qatar and Turkey will succeed. I think that ultimately, I don't know when Jolani will uh, fall. Hopefully, uh, there will be a new, in the coming months, years, there will be a new leadership which respects the Druze, the Christians, the different Muslim sects, and and can bring the country back together, because that's been the tradition of Syria uh, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That land, uh, it wasn't a utopia, but the very fact that these minorities, that the Kurds, all of them, existed side by side, and until now, means that historically that land was more tolerant than it is today. The authorities.
You mentioned Israel and its yeah role in this, but how do you see or how are you reading Israel's yeah wider role? Because I just saw that the Israeli foreign minister went out and condemned the brutality and the massacres by the yeah by Jolani's government, which is strange that Israel can recognize this, but the European Union still feels like they have to provide cover. But the EU side, this is uh, of course one can point out the hypocrisy given the brutality that Israel is engaged in, but also the fact that Israel is has invaded and occupied large parts of Syrian territory. But on the other side, on the Syrian side of the border, we see that Jolani and his government has been very reluctant to be critical of Israel at all, while Israel now goes out and criticizes Jolani. They have, bombed some of the military facilities. So, how do you explain this very strange, yeah, relationship?
I think the Israeli regime has one objective and one objective only, and that is the Balkanization of Syria. And what it wants to do is to divide the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, the Kurds, and to destroy Syrian national identity, and to create these small mini states which are all unstable and constantly at each other's throats, so that the Israeli regime can rule supreme. That's how they function in Lebanon as well. And I think that this is a major danger. And that also could be one reason behind the American statement. I think the influence of Tulsi Gabbard is definitely there. That's my guess, of course. But I also think perhaps some people who in the U.S. government who went along with this may have also been calculating that the Balkanization of Syria would be a good thing for the United States, because it would be a good thing for Israel. None of this is good for the United States, by the way. Nothing. None the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust in Gaza, the slaughter in Lebanon, or none of this is good for the United States. But the United States has sacrificed its own interests for the sake of the Israeli regime. In my opinion, the Israeli regime is a burden to the United States. What its status during the Cold War, debatable, but in my opinion, right now, it's just a liability. But the United States and the Europeans will accept that. So I think there's no doubt that the Israelis are not sincere. Initially, um, I think that Netanyahu, the reason after the fall of the Assad government, I think Netanyahu, he invaded large parts of Syria because of it for his own self-interest, because he wanted to show himself as strong and victorious, to keep his coalition together, to stay in power. the same logic that lied behind what he did to Lebanon, the genocide in Gaza. I think all of this is linked to Netanyahu's personal self-interest. But I think what he did inadvertently, uh, how should I put it without not seeming, um, not sounding ugly, but inadvertently he strengthened the resistance because his troops are more overstretched than before, but B, far more importantly, he showed that the new status quo, he exposed the new status quo as being, as you pointed out, uh, ineffective against the Israeli regime, unwilling uh, to stand up to the Israeli regime. Jolani and his Al Qaeda and ISIS were quite willing to behead people on the streets, to slaughter people, as we saw again uh, yesterday and the day before. But he's unwilling to take a stand against Israeli occupation of huge swathes of territory in the south. And I think that was a major mistake. So what they did was they strengthened what they vindicate. They, as I was saying earlier, he helped vindicate the resistance. And I think the continued actions of Jolani, Turkey, well, Erdogan, because I think many in Turkey, I know many in Turkey are completely opposed to Erdogan's policies in Syria for the last decade and a half. But um, the resistance has been vindicated. Remember, and I'm sure you do, um, Hezbollah was uh, was and Iran, of course, but Hezbollah was heavily demonized by many Sunnis in the Arab world in particular because of the anti-Hezbollah propaganda that they were killing Sunnis in Syria, that and all these oil and gas rich dictatorships, they were the ones that were fueling this sectarianism. Um, After what we saw in Gaza and the fact that Hezbollah took huge hits and made huge sacrifices for the people of Gaza, whereas no one else did anything, and neither did Jolani and his people. Uh, but now people are seeing what's happening in Syria. And I think probably you too see what I'm seeing. The mood in much of the um, world has shifted towards Hezbollah and even has even shifted with regard to Syria. If you go and look at what many of our friends and many people who've been highly critical of the Israeli regime during the past year and a half, and who've been pounding the regime over the year and a half, many of these people in the previous decade were basically repeating the American narrative on Syria. And a lot of our friends, I won't name them, uh, I mean, they when they saw reality, they had the intellectual courage and honesty to shift their position. So today, Hezbollah is seen in a very different light. Today, Ansarullah in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, um, Hamas, the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Force. When the ceasefire in Gaza started, Abu Ubaidah thanked them and no one else. Of course, he thanked Iran as well, but he didn't thank Jolani or any of these terrorist groups, ISIS, Al Qaeda, or any of their affiliates. So I think, in a sense, all these events, although tragic and very disturbing in Syria, in Gaza, and in Lebanon, they have changed the popular mood, both with regards to the Israeli regime, but also with regards to this horrific project that the West initiated in Syria, Occupation Timber Sycamore. People now, many more people than ever before, see what's going on in Syria in a very different light. Just like Ukraine. A couple of years ago, I would say that most elites in Iran uh, were deeply influenced. I can't say most elites, but maybe most, many at least, were influenced by Western narratives on Ukraine. But now that has changed. that has it has gradually shifted. And I think you see the same in Syria, you see the same in Gaza and in Palestine, you see the same in Yemen. Yemen was very unpopular in the Arab world. People sided, thanks to the media, and Al Jazeera supported the Saudi attack and genocide in Yemen. People sided with the Saudis. But now Ansarullah is a household name across the Arab world. Of course, I should point out that Al Jazeera supported, and so did Turkey. They supported the Saudis, but then later, when the differences between Saudi Arabia and Qatar increased, and then which subsequently led to the blockade, the position of Al Jazeera shifted. But during the first few years, there was a unanimous the Arabic media was almost unanimous in its hostility towards Ansarullah. So sorry for rambling. The point that I'm trying to make is that views have shifted. Many people have died. Many people have been slaughtered, whether in Lebanon or in Yemen or in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Syria. But I think people are much more understanding of what's really going on today than before.
I think you're definitely correct on this because I also get the impression that the narratives which were built have begun to to break down. I just want to ask as a final question is if you have any predictions, do you still see Jolani's government as being not doomed but destined to fail over the foreseeable future? And do you see a clash between his government and Israel, possibility of Lebanon or Iraq being pulled into this? How would you, again, I always point out nobody likes to look in a crystal ball because it's too many variables to make any clear predictions. But if not make prediction, what do you think are possible risks or directions we might be heading at least?
I don't think he's going to last very long. I don't know if that means months or a year or two, but I don't think he's going to last very long. And I don't see him standing up to Syria. The only people he's going to stand up to, in my opinion, is uh, women and children. His henchmen will continue to kill them, and some people, sadly, because of sectarianism or the fact that they don't want to accept that they made a mistake, or because of propaganda coming from oil and gas-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf and the Turkish government, they will continue to back these terrorists. But I think most people by now really know what's going on, and I don't think that his government is effective. They will not be able to manage. This is a state. This is Syria is a civilization. It's been around for thousands of years. It's one of the oldest civilizations that land, Sham, on the planet. And Syria today, like any other country, has a sophisticated people. There's the issue of healthcare, higher education, schooling. Uh, Cities need to be managed. These terrorists have no capability. They have no understanding of how to run a government, and they are far more extreme than what we see in Afghanistan. So I don't think that they're going to last. I think there will be uh, bloodletting. I think a lot of blood will be spilled, but I don't think they will last. I mean, hypothetically speaking, the only entity that would support Syria in any confrontation with the Israeli regime is the axis of resistance. Turkey sells Baku oil to Israel, a discount, cheap oil, and the oil from Syria Kurdistan that the Americans are still stealing, it goes through Turkey and to Israel from my understanding. So Turkey has no real problem with the Israeli regime. They're doing business as usual. Turkey, Jordan, under current management, they're not going to help Syria against the Israelis. So if Jolani ever wants to contemplate taking back Syrian territory, which I'm not quite sure he's thinking about that seriously. He would have to turn to the resistance. But after slaughtering all these women and children, I think he's gone too far, way too far.
I agree. Anyways, Professor Marandi, thank you so much for your time. I yeah really appreciate it. So yeah, I hope this the efforts to intensify this sectarianism fails, and yeah, some normalcy will obviously return to Syria. So thanks again for your time.